Hopefully we are. Lovely. Good morning, everyone. My name is Mary Leiden. Kristen Reed and I are your 10th grade networking co-chairs. And we're really, really happy today to have with us Larry Sullivan, our 10th grade principal, whom you all will recognize, Cindy Rivera and Laura Keene from Guidance, and our special guest today, Whitney Longworth from Summit Test Prep here in New Canaan, to just walk us through a little bit of the process about, what really are the SAT and the ACTs, what do they mean these days, etc. So we'll start off today. I think Larry was going to offer just a quick hello, and then we'll get on with our program. And thanks everyone for joining.
Great. Hi, everybody. Just wanted to say hello. I'm thinking this may be the last time we're doing PFA networking meetings this way. As you know, we are getting ready to be able to welcome parents back into the building for in-person meetings. Really looking forward to that. I think you'll find today very informative. Many of you, I'm sure this is your first child who's going to be entering into this college testing process. And even those of you who have older children, as Mary alluded, the ground has shifted on some of these things in terms of schools and testing and what's required versus what might be a good thing to do. So I'm looking forward to it. As I think you all know, I have a sophomore in a different high school, and I'm going to be taking notes selfishly about this as well. So I know Cindy is going to introduce Whitney and sort of the scope of our program today.
Thanks, Larry. Yes, today we are welcoming Whitney Longworth. As you heard, she is the Director of Business Development at Summit Educational Group, which is here in town. She graduated from Connecticut College, cum laude, congratulations. And then we here at NCHS at New Canaan have worked with Whitney for years, and we've partnered with her to stay up to date on the ever-changing landscape of SAT and ACT dynamics, particularly in the last few years. There have been many changes, both in their platforms and how college admissions considers testing. So in her role with Summit, she partners with public and private schools throughout New England to provide test prep resources, and we have always valued our partnership. She's been an expert panelist and frequent guest speaker for school programming, as well as annual education conferences. So we're going to ask Whitney to take this on over and present to us. Lori and I and Larry will kind of field questions as they come through on the Q&A. So that's where you would post questions. And hopefully we'll have a very nice program today. I'm sure we will. So Whitney, I'll let you take it over. Welcome.
Okay, thanks so much. Thanks everyone for tuning in. I always say how much I appreciate it because I know that of all the pieces of the college admissions puzzle, the testing is not the fun part. Or it isn't for most people, maybe for me, but I know this is usually a part that causes a lot of anxiety for students and their parents and guardians. So my hope this morning is that I'm going to give you a clean, clear amount of information so all of you leave this feeling a little bit less anxious about this. Because I think when it comes to the college process, knowledge is power, and there's so much misinformation out there. So I'm just trying to help you kind of get through that and just know what you really need to know about the testing. Now, I do have a free downloadable guide. It's about 90 pages, and it does include all the information I'm going to cover today. So I am going to put that in the chat towards the end that you could download. So don't feel like you have to take copious notes, although be flattered if you do. So I always start with this slide. Every year, the National Association of College Admissions Counseling surveys all the college reps from across the world, right? And they go through all the different admissions factors and ask them to weight the amount of importance in terms of considerable, moderate importance they're putting on certain factors. Now, I don't have the 2020 yet because they are behind because of COVID, but this is from 2019, so it is prior to COVID. But the reason I show this slide, and this is not comprehensive, there's more factors in the college process, of course, but is that testing was up there, right? It was pretty high up there, but the three categories that always rank above testing are grades and courses, grades and college prep courses, and strength of curriculum. And that's because ultimately every college is using your transcript as their number one piece of information about your student, because they really want to figure out how your student's doing day in and day out in the classroom, because they want to figure out, if they admit them, how is that student going to perform in their classroom, right? So ultimately, I just want you to keep that perspective in mind, because testing is really a supportive piece that can sort of help sort of shed light on transcript and academic performance, but it will never have more weight than your student's performance in school. So when it comes to testing, just making sure we're making good choices and never sacrificing any time or energy that should be going towards schoolwork, towards test prep or testing, because that will not end up paying off in the end. Okay, so test optional has been trending in the headlines since COVID hit, but it's actually been around for decades. And I showed this list of colleges for perspective because these are some of the most selective colleges in the country who were all test optional before the COVID pandemic. So, you know, a lot of the New England small colleges, the University of Chicago, like a lot of very reputable schools. And they have been working with test optional for years and navigating that process. Now, because of COVID, you may have heard, essentially at a certain point, all of the test sites had to shut down. So students couldn't even access a test, let alone, you know, take it more than once. So essentially, all the colleges and universities, almost all in the country, were sort of forced to go test optional because there was no way their applicant pool was going to have testing available. So, I mean, even the Ivy League, yes, all of these colleges were test optional. But now we're in a situation where we're sort of hopefully coming out of COVID. So there's been this sort of test optional window that has kept going with most schools. And most of these schools, now that they've experienced going test optional, have said they're going to continue it or definitely continuing it for another year. But there are a few who have reverted back to tests required. So for example, Georgetown, very popular school, they've reverted back to tests required. University of Georgia state system. So there are going to be some colleges and universities that are going to go back to requiring tests of all applicants, but I would say the majority, like this test optional thing, they're going to stick with it. And to be clear, test optional means what it sounds like. You have the option as to whether or not you want to submit scores. So your student tests, does well, thinks those tests are supportive of their application, they can submit and those tests will be part of their application to those schools. But if they didn't have the opportunity to test, or maybe testing didn't work out for them in terms of how they performed on the tests, or it seems misaligned from how they're performing in school, they can choose to withhold those scores and not send them as part of their application. And these test optional schools stand behind that and say they can evaluate your student's application without them. So when it comes to navigating this process, you know, I try to tell students it's sort of a win-win. Like, look at it this way: if you're going to go through this testing process and you do well, that's great. It's something else you can submit with your application. If the testing process doesn't go the way you want it to, it can be information you don't have to send with your application. You know, it's not necessarily a strike against you that you have to submit. So just keeping that in mind. Now, there are some caveats to this. So, of course, as sophomore parents and guardians, there could be more schools that revert back to tests required. I don't think it will be a high percentage, but every year schools tend to sort of rolling announce what they're doing because their board has to approve, their financial aid office sometimes gets involved. So usually you'll see those announcements trickling in the spring through the summer. So something to just keep your eye on. That being said, if your student is planning on being a college athlete, right now, test scores are still required through NCAA for eligibility. Again, NCAA is looking at that now that so many schools are test optional, but for now it is a requirement, so something to think about. Another thing is merit scholarships. So, you know, financial aid is based on need-based financials, and that's separate, but merit aid scholarships are awarded based on academic performance. And many schools use a combination of your grades, so your GPA, with your test scores to calculate those scholarships. Now, because of test optional, many schools had to figure out how are we going to navigate this without test scores, but some are still using the test scores as part of the calculation. So this is an example. This is Miami University of Ohio, but you can see how with the same GPA, but with a bump in the test score, it can really significantly impact the scholarship range. So If you're looking at schools and you are thinking you might go test optional, but certainly interested in merit scholarships, which who isn't, right? College is on an upward trajectory of cost, right? You can always call the financial aid offices as a prospective student, and you can always ask, do you use test scores in calculating your merit-based scholarships? And that's public information. They're usually very happy to share that information with you, so you can make an informed decision about that. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about creating a testing plan. So first step being figuring out which tests you should take, then when should you take them, and a little bit on how you can prepare for them as well. So in terms of tests, so I'm really going to spend the majority of today on SAT and ACT, because those are the two big ones. And I've crossed out the subject tests because the SAT subject tests were permanently discontinued. So if you've heard anything about them, you don't need to worry about them anymore. Those were the 60-minute individual subject tests. You may have known them as SAT-2s. They kind of kept rebranding them, but College Board essentially did away with them. It was very few colleges that were requiring or recommending them, but I know it's something that was sort of out there. So it's not something you need to worry about. And then AP, I'm not going to really talk about AP today, but that is the sort of other test in the process, and the guide I'm going to link to does have more information on them. So PSAT, the P stands for preliminary. I like to say the P stands for practice. When your student does the PSAT, it's really just to give them exposure to the test and for them to sort of have a baseline score. And also, since the SAT is the state test for juniors, it's also sort of giving the school district like some data on how the students are doing and are they on track towards those sort of junior year baseline scores. Now, the important thing about the PSAT to keep in mind is that when you may have taken them, they used to be predictive. So you would sit for the PSAT in October, you get your scores back, and it would say, based on how you did today, we think when you take the SAT in the spring, you will get this score. Now it's vertically aligned. So if you look at my little axes here, you can see they're lined up together. So there's a slight differentiation in the score. It only goes up to 760 instead of 800 a section. But they're vertically aligned, meaning when your student takes the PSAT in October and they get their scores back, the scores say, based on how you did in October, this is how you would have scored on the SAT that day. So I think what the important differentiation is that those scores are going to come in lower than anyone would like them to see, because the SAT is designed for juniors and it's designed generally to be taken towards the end of junior year. So your student is going to be, ahead of that when they're taking this test. It's really just a baseline, and just to keep that in mind, because I know when you start looking at colleges and median score ranges, those can be really high numbers. So just sort of keeping some perspective and making sure your student doesn't feel defeated seeing those PSAT scores come in a little bit lower than they hoped. Just really treating it like a practice test, and it sort of lets them know where they are and what they may need to work on. Now, I like to show this graph because we are in New England and College Board, who owns the SAT, is in New York. So we tend to be a little bit SAT biased in our neck of the woods. The ACT was sort of created as a rival test to the SAT in the 60s, and it's based in Iowa. So what ended up happening is that states in the Midwest and the South started adopting it. So, when I applied to college, I didn't even really know what the ACT was. And I think only schools in Ohio that I was looking at were even accepting it. But now both tests are accepted universally. It does not matter which test you take. It's just really a matter about finding which test is going to be best for you. I showed this graph just to give perspective that at a certain point, the ACT was actually the dominant test sort of nationwide. And that you can see SAT has sort of overtaken. There's sort of a market share situation like Coke and Pepsi or UPS and FedEx. But ultimately, almost 2 million students are taking both. So just keeping that in mind, obviously the SAT is the state test in Connecticut. So all juniors are going to take that in the spring as part of a school day test. So if the SAT is the right test for your student, that's going to make a lot of sense. But it's worth exploring the ACT and seeing if your student might actually be showing a preference to that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Just not having any bias against it, because I always get the question, but can I really submit an ACT score to XYZ school? Yes, they weigh them equally, and we'll look at a concordance chart later to see how they do that. So this is a side-by-side comparison of the tests. They're both long. They're over 3 hours. I think the key here to keep in mind is that they're both testing the same concepts in different ways. The SAT is a power test and the ACT is a speed test. So the SAT, we call it a power test because you have more time, but you're going to need to use that time to decode what it's asking you to do, right? Really working through the question to figure out, what did it give me? What am I supposed to do here? How do I work through a solution to get to the result? ACT is a speed test. It's very straightforward. And if it was untimed, we would all choose the ACT because it's very clear what it's asking you to do. But the challenge is how fast you have to move. And it's for over 3 hours. You know, normally students are not tested that way in school. The only thing I can really compare it to is when they were in elementary school and they do those minute math worksheets when they're learning multiplication. It's sort of like the same concept there. Like not only moving as quickly as you can, but moving as quickly as you can with accuracy, which is an adjustment. Most students are not used to that style of learning. Whenever I show this slide to students, they say, "Thank you so much for coming, Whitney. I'm going to take the ACT." And that's because they see that the SAT opens with that 65-minute reading comprehension section, whereas down below, the ACT is just a 35-minute reading section. But you have to keep in mind when we're looking at power versus speed, they have almost the same length of reading that needs to get accomplished. The challenge here is that you're going to have to move through 35 minutes to get it done on the ACT side. So just sort of keeping that in mind. When we look at the scoring, it is back on a 1600 scale. So that's pretty, might be similar to what parents and guardians had if they took the SAT. But so you have a reading section and a writing and language section that combine to give you an evidence-based reading and writing score. You may have known that as verbal, out of 800 points. And then on the math section, there's 2 subsections. So we have a math section with no calculator, which actually can be really challenging for students because, you know, towards the end of middle school, they start having calculators in math class and we go everywhere with their smartphone, right? So all of a sudden, ooh, how do I do long division comes back, right? And then of course the calculator section, those 2 scores are combined to give you a math score out of 800 points. There was an optional essay at the end that has also been discontinued, so it's no longer an issue, no longer something that's required or expected from colleges. On the ACT, we have 4 sections: English, math, reading, and science. They are all on a scale of 36 points. And at the end, all 4 scores are averaged together to give you a composite score out of 36 points. So in terms of major differences, there is just the one math section that's all with calculator. And then of course there is a unique standalone science section. The optional ACT essay still exists for now. That score does not affect your composite. It's a separate score. At this point, I would say no colleges are really expecting it since no SAT testing students will have an optional essay to submit. So I wouldn't put too much weight or worry on it. Okay, so I'm gonna do a little side-by-side just so you can kind of see a deeper dive here. So of all the sections, the SAT writing and language and the ACT English are the most similar. You know, this is not the section that will tip the scales one way or the other for you, but I think what's challenging for students is, you know, over time, in general, we don't study grammar the same way we used to. We don't handwrite things. We all have autocorrects in Microsoft Word, and we're communicating this way with our kids, right? So in the end, the real challenge here is for your students to sort of come back from that and become a copy editor and work through subject-verb agreement and punctuation and all of those things that they may not be used to consciously thinking of. And so that's similar on both tests. Now on the reading, we did just talk about this, right? We've got double the time on the SAT reading. But as you can imagine, because we have double the time, they expect us to dig deeper into what we're reading. So questions are a lot of the times inference-based, not just what did you read, but based on what you read, what conclusions can you draw? And then there are also sets of questions that are evidence-based. So you'll have a question and then a follow-up question that says, which choice provides the best evidence to the previous question? So every line in a passage is numbered and you'll go through to figure out which quotation in the passage best supports my argument. ACT, we don't have time for that. We have 35 minutes to make it to the end. And I can tell you I do this for a living, and sometimes it is a little touch and go for me to make it to the last question in the section. I can still get there with process of elimination, but point being, it's designed for you to run out of time. But keeping in mind, even if you run out of time, you can still score well. Of course, like that's reflected in the scaling of the test. But because we don't have as much time, as you might suspect, the questions are more straightforward and they don't ask for as much inference. So questions are more along the lines of the passage points to. I do always get the question, do you really have to read the passages or can you go to the questions first? Yes, your student should always read the passages first because they intentionally, especially on the ACT, choose reading passages where the tone or main idea shifts about halfway through. So if you just go to the questions and start skimming through, you're gonna miss a key point or change and fall for attractive wrong answers. I know it's not always engaging reading like Harry Potter, so part of the challenge is really having your student stay engaged and stay focused in the material, but as long as they skim the passage first and then go to the questions, they'll be in much better shape than trying to cheat it by going to the questions first and then trying to make their way through it. Now on the math, I think this well illustrates the differences between power and speed again. Okay, so this is how both tests test the same concept of slope. So SAT, the graph of the linear function f has intercepts at a0 and 0b in the xy plane. If a plus b equals 0 and a does not equal b, which of the following is true about the slope of the graph of f? Okay, I'm not gonna make anybody do it yet, but if nothing else, hopefully you might be feeling a little bit of empathy for your students. You may also be having like flashbacks to the SAT old questions with the trains coming towards each other, right? It's a little overwhelming, it's a little confusing. We go to the ACT. If two lines in the coordinate plane are perpendicular and the slope of one of the lines is 3, what is the slope of the other line? Now, you may not remember this rule, but most of your students will because they're doing this day in and day out. So if they recall the rule, it's the opposite reciprocal. So the answer is C, -1/3. But there's no meat on the bone in the question. You know, the ACT is not giving you any information for you to derive that yourself if you don't remember. And if you don't totally remember, look how attractive the wrong answers are, right? 1/3, 3, -3. So that's the trick here. Whereas if we go back to the SAT, if your student can answer the ACT question, they have the skills to answer the SAT question. They just have to take the time to figure out, why did the SAT give me the information they did, right? So if A plus B equals 0 and A does not equal B, that means they're opposite numbers. And they could be any opposite numbers. It won't matter what pair you pick, like 2, -2, 1/3, -1/3, whatever you want them to be. But once you've figured that out, you can plug them into the coordinates a0 and 0b, and you will find the slope of that line will always be positive. So again, power versus speed. And then it's important to keep in mind, I know I said it before, there is that no calculator section on the SAT. Also, about 60% of the SAT is Algebra 1 and Algebra 2. So if your student is taking Algebra 2 as a junior, you want to keep in mind they're going to be better off testing much later into junior year so that they've had exposure to that content. On the ACT, it's more of what I call a variety pack of math. There certainly is algebra, but there is more geometry, a little bit of trig, and a lot of word problems. So more of a variety pack with calculator all the way through. And then the science section. So I said this before, the SAT does not have its own science section. It's unique to the ACT. And on the ACT, it's really a lot of reading passages focused on experiments and data and, you know, scientific theory. And there are a lot of data charts and graphs that they're asking you to interpret. So this is an example of a figure you might see in a science passage. So according to figure 1, the temperature of the outer core is between. So it's really like a scavenger hunt. It's designed just to be a graph or chart your student hasn't traditionally seen and hoping they can kind of work through the data to figure out how to read this properly, right? So here, if we zoom in on the outer core and line it up, even though that looked really intimidating, oh, it's just above a traditional XY graph, and we can find that the answer is C. So for our overly curious students, especially students really passionate about science, this can be challenging because they really want to know the implications of this. What does this mean? Does this impact global warming? Like, no, the question is just what is that temperature range? And then you need to move on. So that in some ways is the most challenging part of the science section, just sort of keeping it contained into what information they're asking from you. Now, SAT, no science section, but they use something called data graphics, right? So they do superimpose data, graphs, and charts into all the sections of the test because they are testing those skills. So just important to note that your student might be reading a reading passage or even editing a passage in the writing and language section, and they will start to see pie charts and graphs pop up and be reading to make sure that the data in the graph aligns with what's in the passage. Okay, so to recap, the SAT is more challenging, right? That slope question was much more intimidating, and it requires a deeper understanding, right? You really have to dig in deeper to everything that you're doing on that test. But there is a narrower focus of skills. You know, if your student is a really strong math student, their score on the SAT is going to be 50% of their score, right? Then there's more time per question. So questions are not individually timed, just the whole section of each section of the test. But on average, you are getting significantly more time per question on the SAT. So if your student struggles with time management or tends to run out of time, something to think about that they might be more comfortable with the pace of the SAT than the ACT. Now, ACT, much more straightforward, like slope question, right? It's very clear what's asking from you, but it requires instant recognition. You are speeding through, so you need to answer that straightforward question right away and then keep going. If you're a nervous student who really likes to check your work, you may not have time to do that because the clock will be running down on you. Broader scope of skills, so there is that unique science section, and then counter, right? So math is only 25% of your score. So if math is a weaker subject for your student, they may benefit by trying the ACT. And it does require that constant rapid pace, and not just for an hour, but for over 3 hours. You know, most students at most have a final exam maybe at school that's an hour or an hour and a half. So students are not used to sitting and being focused for 3+ hours, which is the other advantage to having them do things like taking the PSAT, just getting used to sitting and being focused under testing conditions for an extended period of time. Okay, so now, the $1,000,000 question, which test is going to be right for your student, right? So there's so much misinformation about this, but based on what we just covered, you may already have an opinion about maybe one test that sounds like it might be a better fit for your student. But ultimately, the best way of figuring this out is trying one of each and then comparing them using the concordance table. And when I say trying one of each, you know, that could be using, and I would say 11th grade PSAT score. I wouldn't use 10th grade, but using a PSAT score or a full proctored practice test and really trying them out. And the concordance table is the official chart that College Board and ACT signed off on. All colleges and universities use this. So it's the same scale anywhere you look. And this is how they line up the two scores. So this is how you can compare them. Now, of course, and this is an example, I will tell you 30% of students show a dramatic preference to one test over the other. I've seen things where the results are like several hundred points away from each other. But 70% of students score the same on both tests. So after you've had your student try both of these and they score the same and they're really frustrated that that girl in that presentation told you to do this, I want you to keep in mind that even if they score the same on both tests, there can still be leading indicators that show that one test is more comfortable for them or that they have the opportunity to make greater gains in. So it's still definitely worth doing. And ultimately, figuring out which test your student was more comfortable with, because confidence is such a huge part of this process, and making sure that this isn't feeding into any anxiety or insecurities for your students. So figuring out which one they'll be more comfortable with, maybe not which one they liked more, but which one they disliked less, can be a huge part of this. And then ultimately, when should your student actually be testing, right? So I think, first of all, very important to keep in mind, everybody's on their own schedule, right? Especially when it comes to junior year of high school, there's so much going on. But it's like a race, and everyone is going to start it at a different time, but we're all ending it together at the same time. So you may have a lot of pressure hearing what other students are doing or feeling like you really want to get it over with, but just keeping in mind, in the end, we're all going to end this together. So the tests are offered either every month or every other month. So really, your student could just start taking them now and keep going. And actually, a student in Iowa took the ACT 14 times in a row. So ACT had to put a limit on the number of tests you could take. And spoiler alert, she didn't improve her score after the 4th test. Because, right, you can't just, brute force this. Like, you really want to be thoughtful about this, because beyond everything else, your student has so many other things they need to do and want to do during junior year. You don't want to give this more time or energy, because as we saw in the beginning, that won't pay off for you in the admission cycle, right? So ultimately, this test is designed for juniors, right? And especially in terms of content, you want to be aiming for winter to early spring of junior year as a first test for your student. And even that is subjective. Now, there's always going to be exceptions to this, right? There is the recruited athlete who may be having coaches ask for earlier scores. So there could be situations there. There could be something where your student has something huge going on in the spring of junior year, so you want to try to do this in the fall. So it is a nuanced personal process, but I just want to keep it in mind, because you might be starting the process early, but you still may not be finishing to land with everybody else. So just trying to be reasonable and thoughtful about it so it doesn't go on longer than it needs to. And ultimately, most students are going to take the test twice. And that's because after you sat for it once, most students are like, okay, that wasn't so bad. I could do that again. And we'll talk about super scoring, which is the other reason students traditionally test more than once. And some students will test 3 times, just depending on their goals and their timeline. If your student is looking to test for a 4th time, you really want to stop and evaluate sort of where you are in the process and why they need to test again. Because in my experience, once you hit a 4th test, students tend to really burn out on this. And their scores start to flatline. So you're better off sort of strategically planning dates and spreading them out, and then sort of versus having them go through the cycle of testing multiple times. And usually, the tests are about 2 months apart. So there should be enough time for you to get your results back, see how your student did, figure out what they may want to work on before they sit for it again. If you look, for example, there's the May and June SAT. But I always tell students, you could do that if you're in the zone, but keep in mind your May score coming back. There's not going to be a lot of time to react to that in time for the June test. So it might make more sense for you to wait and maybe retest in August, so you had time to kind of figure out what you wanted to improve on. The other key thing is there is summer testing. Students really don't like when I tell parents that, but again, you want to keep in mind, does that make sense for you? There are very limited test sites in August for the SAT, because schools for the most part aren't necessarily open yet, and there are extremely limited test sites for the ACT in July, because in New England, almost no schools are open. So it is something you need to plan ahead for, but it can be an option to you if your student just doesn't have a way to slot this in over the school year, or you're finding that they really want to try it again before the fall of senior year. That being said, keep in mind there is testing in the fall of senior year. I would not suggest waiting to start it then, but sometimes a student does need to take a test in the fall for whatever reason. And if they take the September ACT or October SAT, those scores do come back in time for early decision applications. And there are November and December testing as well that would come back in time for regular decision. So just trying to be really thoughtful about this, because, if you start this, I get so many phone calls over the summer, right, for students wanting to start in the summer. And you can certainly start preparing in a reasonable way, but it doesn't mean your student's going to hit that October test, be ready to go, hit the score they want, and be done. But if they don't, you just don't want to keep dragging it. It's better to sort of wait and have them test later in a more contained timeline. So this is an example student. Kaden took her practice test in the summer before junior year, so she knew which test she wanted to focus on, takes her October PSAT, and then her first SAT is a school day in March, and then she takes it again in May, and then takes a break, and then hits the 3rd test in August. So again, every plan is going to be different for everybody, but that's sort of just sort of an example to give you guys a sense of how that would work. Now, score choice. So one of the other reasons you don't want to take the test too many times is because there used to be a short list of schools that required you send all of your scores. Now, because of test optional and where we are with COVID, the only school that stands behind this now is Georgetown. I'm just showing you this slide because Yale, Barnard, and Elon used to do this, and I don't know if at some point they may pivot back, so I just want to throw it out there. But for the most part, otherwise, colleges let you just send the scores you want. This is the short list, and really right now just Georgetown, but I know they're very popular, that wants to see every score you have on file. Now, super scoring. So this is the other reason students are going to tend to take the test more than once, is because almost all colleges super score your SAT. I think it's about 90% right now, super score the SAT. So in this scenario, if I'm applying to a school that does not super score, this 1260 in August was my best score, that's what I would send. But if they super score, they will take my best math, which was really in May, with my best evidence-based reading and writing in August, and combine to a super score of 1290. So even though I never got a 1290, that's what I get to submit to colleges. That's what they admit me with. That's what they get to report in their statistics. So it's win-win for everybody. However, it's not win-win when you are getting PSAT scores back and those scores are lower and you're starting to look at colleges and median score ranges and being a little overwhelmed by how high the numbers are. So I just want you all to keep this perspective. When you're looking at those colleges, those are super scores students have scored at the end of this entire process. So that's why those numbers are high up there, right? Now, ACT superscoring is a little less common, but it's still about 80% of colleges. Same idea, right? You're going to take your best section scores and they'll average them to a super composite. Now, you will notice, so here my best score was a 30. I end up with a 31 super score. It is harder to move your ACT super score because ACT is an average of your scores, whereas the SAT is a sum. So it's something to keep in mind. Now, creating a testing plan. So we figured out which tests we're going to take. We figured out what's going to make sense for when we're going to take them. So how are we going to prepare for these? So ultimately, you can do whatever you want for test prep, right? And every test date nationally, students show up with no preparation. They have never seen the test. They may not have a calculator or pencils with them, right? They have no idea what they're going into, right? But I always tell students, if your teacher of your class told everyone, hey, I'm going to put the 10 previous final exams we've had for this class online for all of you. You're all allowed to access them to practice before our final exam. And this is a scaled test. Wouldn't your student want to take a look and try some of that out, right? Because it is a scaled exam. So however your student wants to prepare for this, doing some preparation is going to certainly put them ahead of the pack. And even the fact that your students are studying for the PSAT, for example, is actually, preparing them. So whether your student chooses to, do something on their own, maybe they'll use Khan Academy, which is the free online sort of SAT prep that College Board provides. ACT has something similar, working through a book and practicing, taking a class or working with a tutor, however they want to choose to do that. You want to figure out that target test date and work backwards and then build momentum towards it. So, if you're testing in March, maybe you'll start preparing after the winter holiday break. So leading up, that could be anywhere between 6 and 15 weeks, and that has a lot to do with your student schedule, but just making sure you're building momentum towards the test, right? Those families calling me in the summer is why we always have that conversation, because we could do some things now, but our student isn't testing until May, they're gonna have to pick this back up. So do we wanna do that now, or do we wanna save the time and do it later? And then ultimately, however your student prepares, you want to make sure these 3 things are in mind. So content mastery. So obviously there's content on the test that they want to work through and figure out, what are they weaker on? What do they maybe have not learned that they should review, whether it be triangles or semicolons, what have you, right? And then strategy. These are multiple choice tests. So there is strategy to that, like process of elimination, so working through that and getting used to not necessarily answering the question in the proper long way, but figuring out how to save time by using the answers provided, that sort of a thing. And there is different strategy between the SAT and ACT. And then the number one way to prepare is really working through practice tests, right? So getting used to how is the test structured, what are questions phrased like, getting used to the timing and pacing of that. So having exposure to that will be key, and have your student feel really prepared going into test day. And then in terms of guiding principles, so really most students are going to score the same no matter which test they take, right? But it's always worth looking for a student's best test. It's going to save you time in the end. And also keep in mind, you don't get like extra credit for sending SAT and ACT scores to a college. They're really just going to look at your best score. So you don't need to spend time on both, just sort of figuring out which one's going to be the best use of your time. Preparing for one does help you prepare for the other, however. So if you go down an SAT path, right, like maybe your student did well on that PSAT. They're going to take the SAT in school, but at some point they decide, I think I'd like to try the ACT and see what happens. They'll be more prepared because they've been working on reading comprehension skills, working through that math content, getting used to time testing and multiple choice testing. So they'll be in a better place. There are just different strategies that they might want to review. Then students do score their best at the end of junior year and fall of senior year. It's really rare for a student who's finished by December, even for high schoolers. And that's because even if your student tested, earlier in the fall and did well because of super scoring, they're probably going to want to try it again. So just keeping that in mind, I have seen situations where a student is able to test early and be done, but it's not always the case. And just trying to not drag this out for too long for your student. And then ultimately, I opened with this, but a good testing plan always prioritizes your schoolwork over test prep, right? Testing early and often is generally not sensible. And when I say testing early and often, having your student go in unprepared, like, just try the SAT today, we'll see how it goes. If that doesn't go well for them, that can create testing anxiety, and that can carry through this process. So we're better off waiting to have them test when they feel good and feel prepared and confident than having them do that too early and then affecting the whole process for them. And the other thing, I joke with students about this, but it's true, right? You cannot put test prep as an extracurricular activity on your college application, right? I mean, you can, but colleges aren't going to love that. So you want to make sure that this is taking up just a reasonable amount of time for students. So they're still able to do everything they need to do in the classroom, but also all the things they want to do outside of it, especially with COVID and how that has limited everybody's ability socially and everything else during this time. And then I know this is a little cheeky, but maintain perspective, it is just a test. This is not the piece that gets your student admitted or rejected. It's really a supportive piece of the application. And in this test optional climate, really having your students feel like they're more empowered in a situation where doing really well on this test could be helpful to them. But if that's not the case for them, it may not hurt them in this process as well. All right, so I'm going to post in the chat the link to the guide so that people can download that because that has more information on this. And then I think we could look at questions. And of course, if anybody has any other questions, they're welcome to put that in the Q&A.
Great. I'm going to just change the view so it's just not your face right there. Thank you so much, Whitney. That is such a good amount of information that's really helpful for us. And before we get to questions, one thing that I did think in terms of, I know we have sophomore parents here, and I just wanted to reinforce that starting now is appropriate for the few. Most of this is we're just getting you the knowledge as you go into junior year that this is a junior year process. And we're just offering this now so you can start to think about all that Whitney was talking about and begin to plan, but not for this year, for next year. So, okay, let's look at some questions. Is there any downside to taking an actual ACT and SAT test to see which they're more comfortable with versus taking the test as a practice?
So, I mean, in theory, not. I think the important piece you want to keep in mind is it's officially on their record. Most schools won't, Georgetown, hey, if you look at Georgetown, don't do it. It'll be on your record. I think the bigger thing that I found is, students, unfortunately, I feel like more and more students every year are dealing with some level of anxiety, especially coming out of COVID. I think students who maybe were in a really healthy place may still be experiencing that. So anything we can do to relieve that in this process is important. And when a student sits for an official test, and they get that score back, that hits deeper than when it's a practice test they did in simulated conditions. So if you can avoid having them do it as an official test, I really would recommend doing that just because of the consequences that can have. I mean, ultimately, if that's the only way or they're having a really chill attitude about it, you could do it that way. But I would just caution you, if you can avoid having that situation, your student might be in a better place going through this in terms of level of confidence.
Yeah, I would agree. That level of anxiety that hits kids is very real. And sometimes that practice is just that much more relaxing and helps to build their confidence before they sit for the real thing.
Well, I should say also, when you do a practice one, normally you can have the full practice test of all of the questions and go back through it. When you do an official one, you get your scores back, but you don't get to necessarily get the full test booklet. It depends on the date, and there's sort of more bureaucracy to that. So the other nicer part is you get the results back faster with more information if you do a practice test.
There is a question here about which test would you recommend for students applying to overseas universities?
So in my experience, if we're looking at like European or Canadian schools, well, overseas, okay, so mostly European, they'll accept both tests. They do really like tests in Europe, I'm going to tell you. So they may not necessarily be test optional for your students, but in my experience, at this point, they're very used to taking the ACT or the SAT. They'll use concordance charts just like we do. So,
yeah.
Another question is about if our high school offers the PSATs for all juniors in the fall. And yes, we offer the PSATs for all juniors. That's going to be October of next year. And of course, we're going to send you emails. It'll be in the guidance update about the registration process through total registration. So keep that marked on your calendar for next year.
And then if the kid, since most kids will take the PSAT, so does it mean if they end up deciding to take ACT, they'd have to prepare for 2 exams?
So in theory, so here's the thing, right? SAT is the state test, so your student's going to take it. But that being said, I would say if we can figure out sooner if the ACT is their test, then that's what you can spend the time and energy preparing for. Have them still take the SAT, but if they're an ACT kid, they don't have to send their SAT schools to the college. So I wouldn't look at it as having to prepare for both at the same time. I would still pick a path within that.
And I think with the state test being SAT, the classroom experience is more driven towards looking at some prep. It really isn't directed exactly to SATs, but there is some level of that in the classroom as well. Just for information, they can't see the chat section.
Oh,
so if you could put that link into the Q&A, I think that would be helpful.
Oh,
Right, the link of the website and that phenomenal PowerPoint that you gave us today.
Oh yeah. I don't know if I can put it in the Q&A, but if not, I will share it with the counseling team, and that way they can distribute it to 10th grade families, so you guys will all have that.
Okay.
Yeah, I would imagine also when the PFA posts this, we can include the link as well.
Yes, definitely. Great.
And then someone is asking, what is national merit? So go ahead, Whitney, I'll let you take that, but if you want me to answer it.
So national merit is part of it. So the PSAT is also the national merit qualifying test for juniors. So national merit is a national merit competition. They use a combination of students' PSAT scores and then ultimately their ACT scores as well as GPA to calculate scholarships. It's highly competitive. Usually it's, I think, top like 2 to 3% of students in each state get to qualify. And I will tell you, Connecticut is a very smart state. So it's higher here. I think Massachusetts is number 1, but we're right up there in New York too. So it's something to keep in mind. I would say to not put too much energy on it. In my experience, colleges don't put very much weight on it because it's using data they already have, right? GPA and test scores to calculate that scholarship. And the scholarships have not been adjusted for inflation. So 30 plus years ago, those were something, but now they're not huge. But of course,
$500 doesn't go very far.
Right? I mean, it's better than nothing, but don't put too much weight or energy on it. Don't feel like you need to prepare for the PSAT to qualify for national merit. That's not going to be as productive a use of time as having your student use that time towards improving their schoolwork performance. That's what I would say about that.
I agree.
Thanks. And we have some questions around the future of the SAT. We know that there's been some updates for the class of 2025. And we'd just like if you could clarify that some of the changes for our families are asking.
Yes, and the SAT did such a good job of the PR on this that I know everybody's heard about this. So the SAT is rolling out a fully digital test that will be adaptive and will be 2 hours. That is not going to impact students who are older than the class of 2025. So for your students, they will still be taking the traditional paper bubble sheet test that we just talked about. through graduation. Class of 2025 will experience this in their junior year. I don't want to go too in the weeds with this, but I know a lot of you have younger students. So essentially they're readjusting the test. They're trying to make it shorter, to make it easier to facilitate. It will be adaptive, so the testing windows will be longer because they're hoping they'll be like less cheating and all that kind of thing. They're going to keep releasing information every quarter or so as we get closer. So if you do have students in the class of 2025 or younger, when you tune in again to see this presentation for 10th graders, I promise we'll cover that. But for now, for class of 2024 is spared from these adjustments. And then in terms of the ACT is waiting to see how that goes for College Board. So I do not anticipate them doing any changes in terms of digital formatting or realignment of the test before the class of 2025 either, because they have less resource and they're slower on change than the College Board in my experience.
The only caveat I would add to that is for the state mandated SAT, which all juniors take next year, this year for the first year, that will be online. And I would then anticipate that the SAT given in March of, for your guys, it would be 2023, would be online. So
yeah, so that's an important distinction. So that will be digital, but it will be the same format we talked about today. That test will not have that adaptive, shortened length formatting. It'll still be the same structure, but in a digital format.
Great, thank you.
Okay, I think we've gotten most of the questions here. They were excellent questions, so that was fantastic. Just want to thank you, Whitney. You go through it quick and fast. So if anything, was too fast, we did record this, and both the PFA and the school counselors will probably put it on their websites, and we will get the website, your link to the college guide. Can we still get the actual printed ones?
Yes, yep, you can get those too. Mm-hmm. And okay. On the website, you can also order a paper copy if you'd rather have that than download. Mm-hmm.
Perfect. I like to use those in my office, so they're good. All right, everybody. Thank you so much.
thank you all. Be well.
Thank you.